Saint Germain's World Trust. Change is on the horizon. Saint Germain's World Trust important. Comte de Saint Germain Sanctus Germanus. Laughter. I won the bet. And to think they thought that they had got the power to keep you from me. I wouldn't have it. I wouldn't have it. But in my vision you were already free. And so it should be for eternity. I've got no time for temporary things. For they're not there when you need them. I've only interest in those things of earth that can be reproduced so that I can see them. And here I've seeded what looks like an orchard. A delightful array of souls. You delight me. Each one, you delight me. You're fragrant like newly baked rolls out of the oven of the Mother Divine. To feed all these who yet wait, thinking somehow that they'd better be good or they'll get turned away at the gate. Or perhaps thinking if they don't hurry on they won't get into heaven. It's too late. Heaven is not about childish fears or anything that would result in sadness and tears. But heaven is that moment when those who are so clear suddenly manifest before you. I've taken flaws out of jewels before so many times it's like a bore. I've been accused of just about everything. I wonder if I've missed anything. I'm here tonight to simply drop in and to remind you that there's no such thing as sin and all those things that seem to occupy your day and cause you to think, you could have lost your way. For there's nothing wider than heaven's bay, you really can't miss it if you use the violet ray. The violet flame, my claim to fame? Hardly. But I suppose some have said it, and though I've tried so very hard I still seem to end up with the credit. But I didn't do it for that reason, you know. No, I did it so that things would more sweetly flow and so that each one of you would really know that there is such a thing as phenomena. It isn't always apports and it isn't always smoke that issues out of a medium's throat, but instead it's that thing that can turn a bloke into one whose heaven's fires doth stoke, through her love or his great, great devotion. I'll dive in that ocean. The ocean of love. The ocean of freedom. The ocean of soul liberation. And at last I come to this place. I come to this place, for I can help you get rid of your past. Oh yes. Oh yes, the promise is given. The debt, it is paid. The rocket is ridden. The waters now flow. Won't you drink and be healed? For as far as I am concerned, in my heart you are sealed, and evermore, you can wield that magic that is yours to command. Beloved. Beloved. What does it take? Must all manifestation fall and break before you learn that this isn't a fake? But all for your growth and education I radiate then frequencies geared to your soul. And you will know it. You can take a poll. As the weeks go to months and the months go to years, you'll live without your hell-bent fears and instead come to know that the violet flame, it clears those things that now would seem to blind you. Enough. Enough. Though I can be so rough, perhaps careless, some even might say. But you see, it isn't the words or the appearance itself that I bring to you all this day, but instead something far better indeed. A kiss from the violet ray. And so to you all, Namaste, and so I do begin this glorious day. Away. Sanctus Germanus left a little P.S. I guess I should have signed my autograph in your mind, but I thought violet train would betray Street Germain. Sanctus Germanus, Holy Brother, is the Western Latin name for an ascended being whose Tibetan origins as a High Lama who are only just being made known. The great divine director gave this Lama the name of Sanctus Germanus as he took on more and more Western incarnations, one of which was as the mysterious Comte de Street Germain. It has remained his favorite name. In deference to this preference, we shall use the name Sanctus Germanus or Street Germain interchangeably throughout this website. Sanctus Germanus works under the planetary logos, Sanat Kumara, who millions of years ago came to Earth with 7 other beings, including the Archangel Michael and the goddess Kuan Yin, to set up the earthly experiment. The planetary logos has remained as an ever-present brother's keeper throughout the downward cycle of Earth, serving as teacher and guru to other great and holy masters as Kathumi, Maurya, the mysterious K-17, and Jesus. He is also known as the Manu of the seventh root race, an advanced racial stock that will eventually people the New Age. In the 1950s, Sanctus Germanus assumed the position of hierarch of the New Age. As hierarch, Sanctus Germanus will direct Earth's affairs for the next 2,000 years. Sanctus Germanus is to prepare the Earth for the coming of a new avatar, the New World Teacher, who will be under the responsibility of the Lord Kuthumi. The exact shape and form of the new avatar is just emerging in a flood of new ideas and concepts onto the Earth plane. It is conceivable that the new avatar could take the form of a reformed worldwide media, the Internet and all its possibilities, radio, and television, rather than of a person. This is yet to be revealed. Nevertheless, a new era, a new golden age, will be ushered in based on these teachings, and the project of soul liberation, so dear to Sanctus Germanus, will be implemented so that mankind can achieve its ascension by the end of the 2,000-year period. But before this can happen, the great and holy Master Sanctus Germanus will make his presence more and more obvious to mankind as he leads us through a period of upheaval and conflict to banish all vestiges of the dark forces from Earth. As the old makes way for the new and the slate is wiped clean, the roots of the new teachings will start to bear fruit. Past lives of one who evolved on the Earth plane. Each one of us here on Earth today represents a different stage of spiritual evolution that will eventually lead to our ascension, a point at which our souls will no longer be required to incarnate on Earth to further our evolution. Just as Sanctus Germanus incarnated countless times before he ascended, each of us will have a chance to follow his or other masters' examples. We see below how the Master Sanctus Germanus helped to shape the course of mankind's history since the demise of the civilization known as Atlantis. Throughout the thousands of years of reincarnations we can observe two major themes. 1. The nurturing of truth of the ancient wisdom from the child Jesus to the founding of the secret mystery societies that have endured until today, and 2. The liberalization of secular political thought over the centuries that has slowly freed mankind from the tyranny of authority and laid the foundations for future soul liberation. King of the Golden Age in the Sahara. Sanctus Germanus revealed to Jeffrey Ballard, the founder of the I Am movement, the Akashic records of a Golden Age civilization that existed about 70,000 years ago in the Sahara Desert. In this civilization, Sanctus Germanus ruled as king over a fourth-root race population that had emigrated from Atlantis. His reign was complemented by a council of enlightened beings who brought about this golden age of peace and tranquility. In the midst of his reign, the people became more and more obsessed with material and sensual matters, which in their way caused conflict and the scattering of a once cohesive and peaceful civilization. At one point he decided that his people would have to create their own salvation from their ways. He retired into the etheric dimension from where he could influence but not directly rule the people. Another prince, who took over Sanctus Germanus' rule, drove the civilization into ruin, and within a 2,000-year period, the fertile fields and rivers of the Golden Age civilization had been reduced to desert sand. Joseph, the father and protector of the child Jesus. We see the reappearance or Sanctus Germanus as the Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus, many years later at the start of the Piscean dispensation. When Mary reached the age of womanhood, she was betrothed to Joseph, son of Jacob, and a carpenter of Nazareth. Joseph was an upright man and a devoted Essene. Mary told him all the words that the angel Gabriel had spoken to her, and they rejoiced, for they believed that he, the man of God, had spoken words of truth. And when the time was nearly due for Jesus to be born, and Mary longed to see Elizabeth, the wife of Zacharias and mother of the future John the Baptist, so Joseph took her in the direction of the Judean hills. They arrived at Bethlehem at nightfall and decided to spend the night, but Bethlehem was thronged with people going to Jerusalem. The inns and homes were filled with guests. Joseph could find no place to rest but in a cave where animals were kept, and there he took Mary to spend the night. At midnight came a cry, "A child is born in yonder cave among the beasts." And lo, the promised Son of Man was born. Now, when the morning came, Joseph sought out a shepherdess whose home was near, and they prepared a room for Mary and the child. They stayed there many days. In the meantime, Joseph sent a messenger to Zacharias and Elizabeth saying, "The child is born in Bethlehem." Zacharias and Elizabeth took John and headed immediately to Bethlehem with words of cheer. According to Jewish custom, the child was circumcised. And when the temple elders asked, "What will you call the child?" Mary said, "His name is Jesus," as the man of God declared. Beyond the river Euphrates lived the Magians. They were wise, could read the language of the stars, and they divined that a master soul had been born. They could see his star above Jerusalem. Among the Magian priests, there were 3 who longed to see the master of the coming age. They took costly gifts and headed west in search of the child, the newborn king, that they might honor him. One took gold, the symbol of nobility, another myrrh, the symbol of dominion and of power, and the third, gum, the symbol of the wisdom of the sage. When the Magians reached Jerusalem, the people were amazed, and wondered who they were and why they had come. And when they asked, "Where is the child that has been born a king?" the very throne of Herod seemed to shake. King Herod then sent a courtier to bring the traveling Magians back to his court, where he queried them, "Where is the newborn king?" And then they said, "While yet beyond the Euphrates we saw his star arise, and we have come to honor him." And Herod blanched with fear, thinking, perhaps, the priests were plotting to restore the kingdom of the Jews. He wanted to know more about this child that has been born a king. Then Herod called the Magian priests again and said, "Go search, and if you find the child that has been born a king, return and tell me all, that I may go and honor him." The Magians went their way and found the child with Mary in the shepherd's home. They honored him, bestowed upon him precious gifts and gave him gold, gum and myrrh. Yet these Magian priests could read the hearts of men. They read the wickedness of Herod's heart, and knew that he had sworn to kill the newborn king. And so they told the secret to Joseph and Mary and advised them to flee beyond the reach of harm. Then the priests returned homeward, skirting Jerusalem. Well warned, Joseph took the infant Jesus and Mary in the dead of night and fled to Egypt, where they lived with Elihu and Salome in ancient Zone for a few years. When Herod found out the Magians had bypassed him in Jerusalem, he declared that all baby boys should be killed. Elizabeth fled with John to the Judean hills, but her husband Zacharias was slain by Herod's men. It was during this time in exile with Elihu and Salome in Zone that the infant Jesus grew up, learning the secrets and mysteries of the ancient wisdom. Elihu and Salome taught him about Zoroastrianism, the mystery schools of Egypt, and Buddhism in India. These teachings would provide him the impetus later on to travel by foot to Persia, India and Tibet to study under the masters of wisdoms. He would return to Palestine imbued with these teachings and prepared for the world teacher, the Lord Maitreya, to overshadow him during the last 3 years of his life on earth. When it was again safe, Joseph secretly conducted his family back to Nazareth. By the time Jesus was 10, he was already sitting with the temple elders and teaching them. When Jesus reached the age of 12, Joseph realized that it was time to release him into the hands of the sages and elders of the Jewish religion for more training. He also took charge of John, son of Elizabeth, after Zacharias had been slain by Herod's men. He saw to it that John was inducted into the Essene sect. John, overshadowed by the spirit of Elijah, became the forerunner, the harbinger, to Jesus' mission on earth, and in the process, was beheaded by Herod. So it was that Sanctus Germanus' incarnation, as Joseph was to assure that the child Jesus was protected from the dangers posed by the political rulers of the times, and to see to it that he was properly instructed in the ways of the ancient wisdom. Sanctus Germanus, founder of the Rosicrucian, Mason, and Knights of Columbus movements. It is said that the Master reincarnated at least once per century since his favorite incarnation, as Joseph. As the Christian Church merged its interest with that of the Roman emperors in the 3rd century, the true mystical teachings that were part of the Christianity, such as reincarnation, the link between Jesus' teachings and that of the Brahmins of India, etc. became distorted and detached from their source. It is at this stage that we see the Master Sanctus Germanus step in to try to preserve the original teachings of Jesus in the secret societies. According to the Master Moria, Sanctus Germanus is the true inner sovereign Grand Master of both the Masonry and the Knights of Columbus. In one of his incarnations, he lost his life defending the teachings of the ancient wisdom. He was born as Albinus into a Roman family in the town of Verulam, England. Albinus returned to Rome where he became a Mason, then journeyed back to Verulam and became active in public affairs. Yet by order of the emperor in 303 AD, Albinus was subsequently beheaded along with other Masons and heretics. Shrouded in their own self-imposed mysteries today, the Rosicrucians, Masons, and Knights of Columbus all admit to a chief role played by Sanctus Germanus in their rites and ceremonies. Sanctus Germanus as Merlin, spiritual advisor to King Arthur, circa 600 AD. In Sanctus Germanus' incarnation as Merlin, the spiritual advisor to King Arthur, El Moria, we see the first seeds being sown for just human governance, a step in the direction of soul liberation of mankind, a theme that would characterize his subsequent incarnations over the centuries until today. Information about Merlin's life varies widely from story to story in the body of Arthurian legend. In one version, he is conceived when his father, an incubus, male demon, lies with his mother, a nun at Carmarthen in southwestern Wales, while she is asleep. Some early tales portray Merlin as a warrior who goes insane after a battle, gains the gift of prophecy, and flees to spend his life in the Caledonian forest in Scotland. Later versions of Arthurian legend present Merlin as an aged magician whose life is marked by marvelous deeds and experiences. According to tradition, Merlin arranged for the conception of Arthur when King Uther Pendragon of Britain fell in love with Igraine, a married woman. For transforming King Uther into the likeness of Igraine's husband so that she would willingly lie with him, Merlin asked for their child in return. When Igraine gave birth to Arthur, a child of royal blood, the Master Moria took that incarnation. Merlin took the child Arthur to a man named Hector to be raised as a commoner. After King Arthur died, Merlin notified the barons of Britain that God had established a test to determine the successor to Arthur's throne. In front of a cathedral appeared a large stone topped with an anvil, in which a sword was embedded. Only the rightful king would be able to withdraw the sword. And of course, only Arthur was able to withdraw it, and he became king. As spiritual advisor to King Arthur, Sanctus Germanus as Merlin, inspired the king to institute the first modifications to the feudal system of governance. This was the famous Knights of the Round Table, where feudal princes occupied seats around a table, all being considered equal in power. It was through this radical system of governance that King Arthur's realm, England, enjoyed a brief period of unprecedented peace and prosperity, that one brief moment known as Camelot. Under Merlin's advice, the first principles of the rule of law rather than of the sword began to emerge, and upon King Arthur's insistence, a judicial court system was instituted whereby law rather than fiat became the criterion for judgment, and solid observable proof had to be presented in order to condemn a man for a crime. Sanctus Germanus as Roger Bacon, 1211–1294, sowing the seeds of liberal thinking. Sanctus Germanus' emergence as the English scholastic philosopher and scientist and one of the most influential teachers of the 13th century would add another theme to his quest for soul liberation, that of logical, objective thinking. Born in Ilchester, Somersetshire, Bacon was educated at the universities of Oxford and Paris. He remained in Paris after completing his studies to teach at the University or Paris. When he returned to England in about 1251, he entered the religious order of the Franciscans and settled at Oxford. He carried on active studies and did experimental research, mainly in alchemy, optics, and astronomy. Bacon was critical of the methods of learning of the times, and in the late 1260s, at the request of Pope Clement IV, he wrote his Opus Majus, major work. In this work he represented the necessity of a reformation in the sciences through different methods of studying languages and nature. The Opus Majus was an encyclopedia of all science, embracing grammar and logic, mathematics, physics, experimental research, and moral philosophy. The response of the Pope to Bacon's masterpiece is not known, but the work could not have as much effect during Bacon's time, because it reached Clement during the period of his fatal illness. The Franciscans condemned Bacon's revolutionary ideas about the study of science as heretical. In 1278 the general of the Franciscan order, Girolamo Massi, later Pope Nicholas IV, forbade the reading of Bacon's books and had Bacon arrested. After 10 years in prison, Bacon returned to Oxford. He wrote Compendium Studii Theologiae, a compendium of the study of theology, 1292, shortly before his death. Despite his advanced knowledge, Bacon accepted some of the popular but later disproved beliefs of his time, such as the existence of a philosopher's stone and the efficacy of astrology. Although many inventions have been credited to him, some of them undoubtedly were derived from the study of Arab scientists. His writings brought new and ingenious views on optics, particularly on refraction, on the apparent magnitude of objects, and on the apparent increase in the size of the sun and moon at the horizon. He found that with sulfur, saltpeter, and charcoal, a substance, now known as gunpowder, could be produced that would imitate lightning and cause explosions. The previous use of gunpowder by the Arabs, however, has since been shown. Bacon considered mathematics, together with experimentation, the only means of arriving at a knowledge of nature. He studied several languages and wrote Latin with great elegance and clarity. Because of his extensive knowledge he was known as Doctor Admirabilis. 6 of his works were printed between 1485 and 1614, and in 1733 the Opus Majus was edited and published. Sanctus Germanus as Christian Rosencrantz, 14th century, keeping the ancient wisdom alive. Charles W. Leadbeater, the renowned theosophist, says that Sanctus Germanus incarnated as Christian Rosencrantz, a monk interested in occult studies and said to be the founder of the Invisible Order of Rosicrucianism in Germany. We know little of his work, but in his later incarnation as the mysterious Count of St. Germain, Sanctus Germanus is known to have a cipher Rosicrucian manuscript bearing the secret codes of the symbolism used in the Rosicrucian movement. Whether he was or was not Christian Rosencrantz, we note the continued trend in the reincarnations of the Master, the preservation of the mysteries of the ancient wisdom. Sanctus Germanus as Christopher Columbus, 1451–1506. Sanctus Germanus as the Italian-Spanish navigator Christopher Columbus was both well versed in theology as well as maritime studies. His personal aim was to a westward route to Asia. He first tried to convince the crown in Portugal to support a westward trip over the Atlantic but failed. He then moved to Spain, where after many difficulties, convinced the Catholic monarchs, Isabel and Fernando, to support his project. His voyage of 1492 failed to land him in Asia. Instead, he had discovered the New World, which made him famous throughout Europe. He managed to secure for himself the title of admiral, and more royal patronage poured in. He made 2 more voyages to the New World after being named the viceroy of his discovered lands and after extracting an agreement from the king and queen to receive 10% of all wealth brought back. However, his fame within a decade became tarnished with charges of corruption in his administration of the new territories. Thereafter he was banned from further movement and died in political obscurity. Sanctus Germanus himself has admitted that during this incarnation, he easily succumbed to personal greed and avarice. However, this does not obscure the fact that through his endeavor, he is credited with opening the New World to the rest of humanity. Sanctus Germanus as Francis Bacon of England, 1561–1626. The planting of ideas. As the first Baron Verulam and Viscount St. Albans, English philosopher and statesman, Francis Bacon became one of the pioneers of modern scientific thought. Following along the lines of his previous incarnation as Roger Bacon, Sanctus Germanus again revolutionized mankind's thinking by introducing ampliative inductive reasoning to the formation of scientific hypotheses, contributing to the fundamental advancement of the scientific method. His work on cleaning facts of prejudice and preconceived notions added much empiricist thinking and logic. As a holder of high office throughout most of his life, he was able to obscure his active involvement in the secret societies of the ancient wisdom. Such activities undoubtedly contributed to his incisive thinking that advanced scientific thinking. Sanctus Germanus was born Francis Bacon on January 22, 1561, at York House, in the Strand, London, and educated at Trinity College, University of Cambridge. Elected to the House of Commons in 1584, he served until 1614. He wrote letters of sound advice to Elizabeth I, Queen of England, but his suggestions were never implemented, and he completely lost favour with the Queen in 1593, when he opposed a bill for a royal subsidy. He regained the respect of the court, however, with the accession of James I to the English throne in 1603. Bacon proposed schemes for the union of England and Scotland and recommended measures for dealing with Roman Catholics. For these efforts he was knighted on July 23, 1603, was made a commissioner for the union of Scotland and England, and was given a pension in 1604. His Advancement of Learning was published and presented to the king in 1605. 2 years later he was appointed Solicitor General. In the last session of the First Parliament held, February 1611, under James I, the differences between Crown and Commons grew critical, and Bacon took the role of mediator. Despite his distrust of James's chief minister, Robert Cecil, 1st Earl of Salisbury. On Salisbury's death in 1612, Bacon wrote several papers on statecraft, particularly on relations between Crown and Commons, in order to gain the king's attention. In 1613 he was appointed Attorney General. In 1616 Bacon became a Privy Councillor, and in 1618 he was appointed Lord Chancellor and raised to the peerage as Baron Verulam. In 1620 his Novum Organum was published, and on January 26, 1621, he was created Viscount St. Albans. In the same year he was charged by Parliament with accepting bribes. He confessed but said that he was heartily and penitently sorry. He submitted himself to the will of his fellow peers, who ordered him fined, imprisoned during the king's pleasure, and banished from Parliament and the court. After his release, he retired to his family residence at Gorhambury. In September 1621 the king pardoned him but prohibited his return to Parliament or the court. Bacon then resumed his writing, completing his history of Henry VII and his Latin translation of the Advancement of Learning, De Augmentis. In March 1622 he offered to make a digest of the laws, with no further consequence despite repeated petitions to James I and James's successor, Charles I. He died in London on April 9, 1626. Bacon's writings fall into three categories: philosophical, purely literary, and professional. The best of his philosophical works are The Advancement of Learning, 1605, a review in English of the state of knowledge in his own time, and Novum Organum, Indications Respecting the Interpretation of Nature, 1620. Bacon's philosophy emphasized the belief that people are the servants and interpreters of nature, that truth is not derived from authority, and that knowledge is the fruit of experience. This philosophy would in part sow the seeds of revolution in the following century. Bacon is generally credited with having contributed to logic through the method known as ampliative inference, a technique of inductive reasoning. Previous logicians had practiced induction by simple enumeration, that is, drawing general conclusions from particular data. Bacon's method was to infer by use of analogy, from the characteristics or properties of the larger group to which the datum belonged, leaving to later experience the correction of evident errors. Because it added significantly to the improvement of scientific hypotheses, This method was a fundamental advancement of the scientific method. Bacon's Novum Organum successfully influenced the acceptance of accurate observation and experimentation in science. In it he maintained that all prejudices and preconceived attitudes, which he called idols, must be abandoned, whether they be the common property of the race due to common modes of thought, idols of the tribe, or the peculiar possession of the individual, idols of the cave, whether they arise from too great a dependence on language, idols of the marketplace, or from tradition, idols of the theatre. The principles laid down in the Novum Organum had an important influence on the subsequent development of empiricist thought. Bacon's essays, his chief contributions to literature, were published at various times between 1597 and 1625. His History of Henry VII, 1622, shows his abilities in scholarly research. In his fanciful New Atlantis, Bacon suggested the formation of scientific academies. Bacon's professional works include Maxims of the Law, 1630, Reading on the Statute of Uses, 1642, Pleadings in Law Cases, and Speeches in Parliament. Bacon was part of the period of Enlightenment, a philosophical movement based on the belief that science and human reason can triumph over political and religious tyranny. An intellectual spirit that knew no national boundaries, it drew proponents from America, England, France, Germany, Italy, Scotland, Spain, and Russia. He is regarded as three English prophets of the Enlightenment along with John Locke and Sir Isaac Newton. American statesman Thomas Jefferson, a disciple of the Enlightenment, agreed with this assessment, ordering for his library in 1789 a composite portrait of the same three men. They had, he wrote to a friend, laid the foundation for the physical and moral sciences of modernity and were the three greatest men that have ever lived, without any exception. It is said that Sir Francis had a secret side to life and served as the Imperator of the Rosicrucian Order, which at that time was a highly secretive organization. He may also have been a leader of the Masons. Sanctus Germanus was to be intimately involved in both earth-shaking revolutions, as we shall see in his next incarnations. Sanctus Germanus as Le Comte de St. Germain, words are put into action. One of the most mysterious characters in modern history is the famous Comte de St. Germain, described by his friend Prince Karl von Hesse as one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived, the friend of humanity, whose heart was concerned only with the happiness of others. Intimate and counselor of kings and princes, nemesis of deceptive ministers, Rosicrucian, Mason, accredited messenger of the masters of wisdom, the Comte de St. Germain worked in Europe for more than a century, faithfully performing the difficult task which had been entrusted to him. The amazing and inscrutable personality in which the adept known as Saint Germain clothed himself was the outstanding topic of conversation among the nobility of the 18th century. During the 112 years that he is said to have lived in Europe, he always presented the appearance of a man about 45 years of age. He was of medium height, with a slender, graceful figure, a captivating smile, and eyes of peculiar beauty. "Oh, what eyes!" sighed the Countess de Hema. "I have never seen their equal." He was an extraordinary linguist, speaking French, German, English, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Russian and Swedish without the slightest trace of an accent, and his knowledge of Sanskrit, Chinese and Arabic showed that he was well acquainted with the East. His proficiency in music was equally remarkable. As a violinist he is said to have rivaled Paganini, while his performances on the harpsichord called forth enthusiastic applause from Frederick the Great. His ability to improvise made a great impression on Reim, who met him in Venice in 1710. Saint Germain was also a composer. One of his musical compositions was given to Tchaikovsky. Prince Ferdinand von Lobkowitz inherited a second, while two others, bearing the dates 1745 and 1760, are the property of the British Museum. The Comte de St. Germain was also a painter of rare ability, famed for his power to reproduce the original brilliance of precious stones on canvas. Although he refused to betray his secret, it was commonly supposed that he produced the effect by mixing powdered mother-of-pearl with his pigments. He was highly esteemed as an art critic and was frequently consulted in regard to the authenticity of paintings. The prodigious memory of the Comte de Saint Germain was a constant source of amazement to his friends. He would merely glance at a paper, and days afterward repeat its contents without missing a word. He was ambidextrous, and could write a poem with one hand while he framed a diplomatic paper with the other. He frequently read sealed letters without touching them and was known to answer questions before they had been put into words. Many of Saint Germain's friends had practical proof of his alchemical knowledge. Casanova relates that one day while visiting Saint Germain in his laboratory, the latter asked for a silver coin. In a few moments it was returned to Casanova as pure gold. Saint Germain also possessed the secret of melting several small diamonds into one large stone, an art learned in India, he said. While visiting the French ambassador to The Hague, he broke up a superb diamond of his own manufacture, the duplicate of which he had recently sold for 5,500 louis d'or. On another occasion he removed a flaw from a diamond belonging to Louis XV, increasing the value of the stone by 4,000 livres. On gala occasions he appeared with a diamond ring on every finger and with shoe buckles estimated to be worth at least 200,000 francs. The charming personality of the Comte de Saint Germain made him a welcome guest in the homes of the nobility of every land. But while he often sat at table with his friends, his own food was specially prepared for him in his own apartments. He ate no meat and drank no wine, his favorite beverage being a tea which he prepared from certain herbs, and which he frequently presented to his friends. His extraordinary popularity was due to his prowess as a raconteur, to his well-known intimacy with the greatest men and women of the day, to his familiarity with occult subjects, and especially to the mystery of his birth and nationality, which he consistently refused to reveal. He spoke with feeling of things which had happened hundreds of years in the past, giving the impression that he himself had been present. One evening, while he was recounting an event which had happened many centuries before, he turned to his butler and asked if any important details had been omitted. "Monsieur le Comte forgets," his butler replied, "that I have been with him only 500 years. I could not, therefore, have been present at that occurrence. It must have been my predecessor." If, as many claimed, Saint Germain affirmed that he had lived in Chaldea and possessed the secrets of the Egyptian sages, he may have spoken the truth without making any miraculous claim. There are initiates, and not necessarily of the highest, who are able to recall many of their past lives. This may have been Saint Germain's way of calling his friends' attention to the doctrine of reincarnation. Or perhaps he knew the secret of the elixir of life. Although no one knew when the Comte de Saint Germain was born, his life from 1710 to 1822 is a matter of history. Both Raymond and the Countess de Giorgi met him in Venice in 1710. 50 years later the aged Countess met him in Madame Pompadour's house and asked him if his father had been in Venice in that year. "No, Madame," the Count replied, "but I myself was living in Venice at the end of the last and the beginning of this century. I had the honor to pay you court then, and you were kind enough to admire a little barcarolle of my composing." The Countess could not believe her ears. "But if that is true," she gasped, "you must be at least 100 years old." The Count smiled. "That, Madame, is not impossible." In 1723 the Count showed his mother's portrait, which he always wore on his arm, to the mother of the future Countess de Genlis. It was a miniature of an exceptionally beautiful woman, dressed in a costume unfamiliar to the Countess. "To what period does this costume belong?" the Countess inquired. The Count merely smiled and changed the subject. From 1737 to 1742 the Comte de Saint Germain was living in the court of the Shah of Persia, occupied with alchemical research. On his return from Persia he settled in Versailles and became an intimate friend of Louis XV and Madame Pompadour. In the following year he was caught in the Jacobite Revolution in England. From there he went to Vienna, and afterward visited Frederick the Great in his castle of Sanssouci in Potsdam, where Voltaire was also an honored guest. Although Voltaire was opposed to Saint Germain's fellow theosophist Saint Martin, his admiration for Saint Germain was unbounded. In a letter to Frederick, Voltaire expressed his opinion that the Comte de Saint Germain is a man who was never born, who will never die, and who knows everything. In 1755 the Comte de Saint Germain accompanied General Clive to India. On his return to France, Louis XV gave him a suite of apartments in the royal chateau of Chambord, in Turin. Here he often entertained the king and members of the court in the alchemical laboratory which the king had provided for him. In 1760 Louis sent the Comte de Saint Germain on a delicate diplomatic mission to The Hague and London. At that time he discovered that the Duc de Choiseul, who up to that time had been implicitly trusted by the king, was playing a double game. Although Saint Germain confided this fact to the king, the former was determined that the peace treaty between England and France should be signed, no matter who received the credit. So one evening in May, 1761, Saint Germain called upon the Duc de Choiseul and remained closeted with him the whole night. This conference resulted in the celebrated alliance known as the Family Compact. This in its turn was the forerunner of the Treaty of Paris, which brought the colonial war between England and France to a close. In the following year Saint Germain was called to St. Petersburg, where he played an important part in the revolution which placed Catherine the Great upon the throne of Russia. He left the country in the uniform of a Russian general, with full credentials to which the imperial seal of Russia was affixed. Shortly afterward he appeared in Tunis and Leghorn while the Russian fleet was there, again in Russian uniform, and known under the name of Graf Saltykov. After the death of Louis XV in 1774, Saint Germain spent several years traveling in Germany and Austria. Among the kings, princes, ambassadors and scholars who met him during those years, how many suspected that the soul of a great adept looked out through the eyes of the Comte de Saint Germain? How many realized that they were conversing with an emissary of that great fraternity of perfected men who stand behind the scenes of all the great world dramas, one who was directing not only the minor currents of European history, but some of the major currents as well? How many were aware of Saint Germain's real mission, part of which was the introduction of theosophical principles into the various occult fraternities of the day? The Rosicrucian organizations were certainly helped by him. While Christian Rosencreutz, the founder of the order, transmitted his teachings orally, Saint Germain recorded the doctrines in figures, and one of his enciphered manuscripts became the property of his staunch friend, Prince Karl von Hesse. HPB mentions this manuscript in The Secret Doctrine, 202, and quotes at length from another, 582. While Saint Germain was living in Vienna he spent much of his time in the Rosicrucian laboratory on the Landstrasse, and at one time lived in the room which Leibniz occupied in 1713. Saint Germain also worked with the Fratres Lucis, and with the Knights and Brothers of Asia who studied Rosicrucian and Hermetic science and made the Philosopher's Stone one of the objects of their research. Although an effort has been made to eliminate Saint Germain's name from modern Masonic literature, careful research into Masonic archives will prove that he occupied a prominent position in 18th-century Masonry. He acted as a delegate to the Wilhelmsbad Convention in 1782 and to the Great Paris Convention of 1785. Cadet de Gassicourt described him as a traveling member of the Knights Templar, and Deschamps says that Cagliostro was initiated into that order by Saint Germain. The Comte de Saint Germain is said to have died on February 27, 1784, and the church register of Erkenford in Danish Holstein contains the record of his death and burial. But as it happens, some of Saint Germain's most important work was done after that date. This fact is brought out in the Souvenirs de Marie Antoinette, written by one of her ladies-in-waiting, the Countess d'Edhema. This diary was started in 1760 and ended in 1821, 1 year before the death of the Countess, and a large part of it is concerned with Saint Germain's efforts to avert the horrors of the French Revolution. Early one Sunday morning in 1788 the Countess was surprised to receive a visit from the Comte de Saint Germain, whom she had not seen in several years. He warned her that a giant conspiracy was underfoot, in which the encyclopedists would use the Duc de Chartres in an effort to overthrow the monarchy, and asked her to take him to the Queen. When Madame de Hima reported the conversation to Marie Antoinette, the Queen confessed that she also had received another communication from this mysterious stranger who had protected her with warnings from the day of her arrival in France. On the following day Saint Germain was admitted into the private apartments of the Queen. "Madame," he said to her, "for 20 years I was on intimate terms with the late king, who deigned to listen to me with kindness. He made use of my poor abilities on several occasions, and I do not think he regretted giving me his confidence." After warning her of the serious condition of France, he asked her to communicate his message to the king and to request the king not to consult with Maurepas. But the king ignored the warning, and went directly to Maurepas, who immediately called upon Madame de Hima. In the midst of the conversation Saint Germain appeared. He confronted Maurepas with his treachery and said to him, "In opposing yourself to my seeing the monarch, you are losing the monarchy, for I have but a limited time to give to France. This time over, I shall not be seen here again, until after 3 successive generations have gone down to the grave." The second warning from Saint Germain came on July 14, 1789, when the Queen was saying farewell to the Duchess de Polignac. She opened the letter and read, "My words have fallen on your ears in vain, and you have reached the period of which I informed you. All the Polignacs and their friends are doomed to death. The Comte d'Artois will perish." His farewell letter, addressed to Madame de Hima, arrived on October 5, 1789. "All is lost, Countess," he wrote. "This sun is the last which will set on the monarchy. Tomorrow it will exist no more. My advice has been scorned. Now it is too late." In that letter he asked the Countess to meet him early the next morning. In that conversation the Comte de Saint Germain informed her that the time when he could have helped France was past. "I can do nothing now. My hands are tied by one stronger than myself. The hour of repose is past, and the decrees of Providence must be fulfilled." He foretold the death of the Queen, the complete ruin of the Bourbons, the rise of Napoleon. "And you yourself?" the Countess asked. "I must go to Sweden," he answered. "A great crime is brewing there, and I am going to try to prevent it. His Majesty Gustavus III interests me. He is worth more than his renown." The Countess inquired if she would see him again. "5 times more," he answered. "Do not wish for the 6th." True to his word, the Comte de Saint Germain appeared to the Countess de Hima on 5 different occasions, at the beheading of the Queen, on the 18th Brumaire, the day following the death of the Duc d'Enghien in 1804, in January, 1813, on the eve of the assassination of the Duc de Berry in 1820. Presumably, the 6th time was on the day of her death, in 1822. What happened to the Comte de Saint Germain after that date? Did he, as Andrew Lang asks, die in the palace of Prince Karl von Hesse about 1780 to 1785? Did he, on the other hand, escape from the French prison where Grosley thought he saw him, during the French Revolution? Was he known to Lord Lytton about 1860? Who knows? Who, indeed? One of the masters spoke of the benevolent German prince from whose house, and in whose presence he, Saint Germain, made his last exit home. In the last decade of the 18th century Saint Germain confided his future plans to his Austrian friend, Franz Graffa, saying, "Tomorrow night I am off. I am much needed in Constantinople, then in England, there to prepare 2 new inventions which you will have in the next century: trains and steamboats. Toward the end of this century I shall disappear out of Europe, and betake myself to the region of the Himalayas. I will rest, I must rest. Exactly in 85 years will people again set eyes on me. Farewell. Clean Wiener Memorian. These words were spoken in 1790. 85 years from that date brings us to 1875. What part did Saint Germain play in the theosophical movement of the last century? What part is he going to play in the present century? HPB gave a cryptic suggestion of the time when he would again appear. The Comte de Saint Germain was certainly the greatest Oriental adept Europe had seen during the last centuries. But Europe knew him not. Perchance some may recognize him at the next era, which will affect all Europe when it comes, and not one country alone. Was the event of which he spoke the last great war, or does the real trail still lie before us? From Count of Saint Germain, from a series Great Theosophists, Theosophy, Volume 27, Number 1, November, 1938, Number 28 of a 29-part series. The Comte de Saint Germain stepped into a Europe full of discord and conflict. Austria and France were pitted against England and Prussia. Russia was stirring up strife in Poland, and England, in addition to warring with France, was also at war with her colonies in America and trying to conquer India. The constant state of war and conflict between the ruling families drew resources away from their respective populations, keeping the masses in a state of abject poverty, while the royalty continued to wine, dine, and scheme on their political alliances. It was obvious to the European royalty that the Comte de Saint Germain was of high birth, for he exhibited the savoir-faire and mannerisms of the court and an extremely high intellectual acumen in most fields of endeavor. But what was all this flamboyance and phenomena about? Could the great Brotherhood of Light have hoped that the powers that controlled 18th century Europe would stop battling each other and listen to the advice of one so endowed and extraordinary? The Comte de Saint Germain made a decision to work alongside King Louis XV, for the king preferred to use secret diplomacy in his matters of foreign affairs. The Comte de Saint Germain also hoped he could bring the warring parties into a federated Europe that would exist in peace. But as a master he could but advise, for under the cosmic law he was bound to respect the free will of those involved. He could but hope that his extraordinary feats demonstrated before their very eyes would add more validity to his words of counsel. As a master, the Comte de Saint Germain could clearly see the future fate of the royalty if they continued on their path of arrogance and war. He laid out these dangers to the powers that be, including the famous Marie Antoinette, Queen of France. But his visions of the future fell on deaf ears. The king's ministers, feeling usurped by the count, plotted to eliminate him rather than take his warnings into consideration. Instead, internecine court plotting took precedence over the looming events. Finally, their arrogant blindness led them into direct confrontation with the masses in the French Revolution. A decade before, the Comte de Saint Germain took time off in Europe to externalize as a gentleman in the back of the room at the Philadelphia State House when the Declaration of Independence was before the body of colonial leaders for signing. When the colonial leaders hesitated, thinking of the war and deaths that would ensue in a war with England, the gentleman stood up and admonished in a loud voice, "Sign this parchment." The Declaration of Independence would create America, an actual place on earth where ideas promoting man's liberation could be implemented. Sanctus Germanus would nurture this creation just as he did as Joseph, the father of the child Jesus. Back in Europe, Sanctus Germanus could not use his powers to strike back at those who sought to kill him. And indeed plot after plot to incarcerate or kill him followed him. No, as an ascended master, that due his enemies would have to be left to the laws of karma. Instead, he merely disappeared, often retreating to the Brotherhood sanctuaries in the mountains of Europe or Asia for meditation and renewal, and then reappeared at key moments when it was safe. Both the American and the French revolutions came about in part from the liberal ideals advanced during the Age of Enlightenment, of which Sanctus Germanus was an integral part in his incarnation as Sir Francis Bacon. The revolutionary ideas that swept over the European continent following the fall of the French monarchy would level the influences of the royal courts forever. Sanctus Germanus played an active behind-the-scenes role in the realization of the idea of America. It is said that he inspired Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, standing firmly behind the emancipation of America's slaves. More is not known about his role in the birth pains of America. We can see that the various incarnations of Sanctus Germanus from Merlin to the Comte de Saint Germain dealt with creating the governing and social context for the liberation of mankind from tyrannical authority and poverty. Again, the great brotherhood of light demonstrated that it is the inevitable power of the word, those thought forms designed to free man's soul, that would triumph over the most powerful of kings. During the 19th and 20th centuries, Sanctus Germanus would turn his attention to the more difficult and arduous process of soul liberation. Sanctus Germanus and the process of soul liberation. During the latter part of the 19th century and throughout the 20th century, the great brotherhood of light externalized itself with ever more force and frequency in the form of the Theosophy, the I Am, Joel Q. Alice A. Bailey, Bridge to Freedom and Summit Lighthouse movements. All these movements would have in common the message of soul liberation. It was no accident that this first embodiment of the ancient wisdom to the West would start in America when Helena P. Blavatsky and Colonel Henry Steele Olcott founded the Theosophical Society in 1875 in New York City. Madame Blavatsky only hints of the role that Sanctus Germanus played in her training and teachings, although one sees him in the precipitated photo in About Us. It would be the masters Kuthumi and Moria who would take on the major task of forming the Theosophical movement in America, Great Britain and India. Blavatsky's seminal works, Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine, would revolutionize Western thinking and reveal to it the existence of the Great Brotherhood of Light and its hand in moving the course of events throughout history. Moreover, Theosophy would introduce the notion that man's true liberation came from the soul within, his higher self, and that each individual was indeed the son of God, if not part of God itself. It revealed to the Western world that Christianity had its roots in the ancient mystery schools of Egypt and India, and that Jesus had indeed traveled there and received instructions from the masters of the Great Brotherhood of Light. That the very foundations of Christianity came from the same source as Buddhism and other religions would plant the seeds for the coming world religion. Revealed to Western thinking what those in the East had known for centuries was that God was within every man's body. He would have to look inward, reconnect with his own soul, and then allow it to infuse his physical body and express itself. This was soul liberation and the salvation of mankind. The Theosophical movement would spread throughout the world by the first quarter of the 20th century, then wane, kept alive by the rich research and insights done by the founders and luminaries during its initial stages of development. Today, their publications continue to provide a firm foundation establishing the ancient wisdom in the Western world. The Tibetan master Jwel stepped in, as internal strife in the Theosophical movement caused it to lose momentum, and dictated an impressive body of teachings to Alice A. Bailey over a period of 40 years. This body of enlightened teachings put in historical and future perspective the ongoing externalization of the Great Brotherhood of Light's activities and revealed the huge body of cosmic laws that governed such activities. It would not be until the 1930s that Sanctus Germanus would again materialize and take a direct hand in the formation of the I Am movement. As with his appearance as the Comte de Germain in the 18th century in a Europe in tumult, his reappearance in the 1930s occurred in the midst of the Great Depression and the World Wars 1914 to 1945. As an ascended master, Sanctus Germanus worked through his messenger Mr. Godfrey Ballard, and together the I Am movement swelled to around 700,000 adherents. The I Am movement carried on the teachings of soul liberation, the God within all the I Am. Another thrust of the I Am movement was to invoke and preserve the idea of America, a revolutionary experiment in freedom, and to keep it out of the worldwide insanity of war and turmoil that had engulfed the earth. In 1941, Mr. Ballard passed on and the I Am movement gradually lost its momentum. The United States of America subsequently joined the warring nations in the Second World War. In the post-war years of the 1950s, Sanctus Germanus again appeared through his messenger, Geraldine Innocenti, to form the Bridge to Freedom movement. Through this rather short-lived movement, Sanctus Germanus revealed more about the structure of the Great Brotherhood of Light, its continued governance of world affairs, and laid before mankind its present and future plans to externalize and usher in the new era. He again appeared through another messenger, Mark Prophet, and formed the Summit Lighthouse movement in the 1970s. This movement attempted to formalize the teachings of the Ascended Masters into a university curriculum to train disciples and initiates for the Great Brotherhood of Light. But as is often the case, the movement became the target of the dark forces, and misrepresentations from the astral plane bearing lookalikes of the Masters began to skew the teachings of the movement, leaving many disillusioned followers in its wake. Sanctus Germanus, the present hierarch of the New Age. We have seen in the various incarnations of the great and holy Master Sanctus Germanus a constant theme of liberating mankind from the clutches of dark thinking and superstition. From the time as Joseph he nurtured the child Jesus and saw to it that he was instructed in the tradition of the ancient wisdom. In his subsequent incarnations he continued to keep the ancient mysteries alive in the Rosicrucian and Masons' secret societies that survive until this day, along with other embodiments of the ancient wisdom such as the Osophy. At the same time, from Merlin onward he sought to liberate man's society from tyrannical authority and raise human thinking and logic, to advance scientific thinking, all this to set the stage for mankind's soul liberation, which we are experiencing today and which we shall see in full bloom in the New Age. With centuries of experience on Earth in various incarnations behind him, the Ascended Master Sanctus Germanus has now been given the responsibility as the growing hierarch of the New Age. Here is what Sir Arthur Conan Doyle said of the Master. The Masters of Wisdom, as you know, play no favorites. If there is a favorite amongst them, it is simply that the will of God be done and fulfilled. And the Master Saint Germain obviously is no exception to this. And so to him the planet, it would almost be like a sphere. He holds in the palm of his hand. He's not only alive with America or Europe or any of the places that he's reportedly to have haunted in the past. Yes, of course, those have all been his stomping grounds. But literally the whole planetary body is subject to his will. He, as it were, takes his place as the growing hierarch of the New Age, Aquarius. Today his presence is felt everywhere in the world. Unbeknownst to most, Sanctus Germanus has been the inspiration and promoter behind the tremendous explosion of innovations involving the computer and the Internet. Each time you sit down at your computer and log onto the Internet, think of the great and holy Master Sanctus Germanus. Through email and the semi-instantaneous access and connection to information all over the world, you are experiencing in a small way, the precursor of the integral knowingness of the New Age. Email is right now the crude precursor to mental telepathy, which will be the basis of communication in the advanced stages of the New Age. Of course, the greed that accompanied the dot-com rise and fall had to be flushed out, but the technology and potential of broadband connections around the world stand ready to be exploited. It will just be a matter of time before the Earth will experience forms of the Internet heretofore inconceivable. And Sanctus Germanus uses this innovation in ever more frequency and power to get his message of soul liberation to mankind. But before these great promises of soul liberation and peace can be realized on Earth, we must pass through yet another period of earthly turmoil. In the year 2000, the great cosmic beings responsible for Earth decided to accelerate the pace of Earth's evolution to make up for the various setbacks encountered during the Piscean dispensation. Time will fly, so to speak, but the temporary result will be a world engulfed in insanity. What will appear to the material eye as a collapse of the financial, economic, and political structures in the world and the rise of terrorism, war, and plain insane behavior worldwide must be interpreted as a grading process. the weeding out of the evil influences on earth, the separation of the tares from the wheat. At the helm of this momentous purging of Earth's dark forces is the great and holy Master Sanctus Germanus, again appearing at this particular flashpoint as he did in past history to guide and protect us at the threshold of the new age. The story of how this change will occur takes us back to Tudor England. There was an enigmatic character by the name of Saint Germain. He learned the secrets of alchemy by studying ancient esoteric knowledge into the occult. He was literally able to turn lead into gold, rocks into diamonds, and later was able to transmute his mortal body into an immortal angel conquering death itself. With his elixir of life and positive thinking he never aged at all. According to Germain, it is the activity of our nerves, the flame of our desire, the acid of our fears, which daily consume our organism. He who succeeds in raising himself above his emotions, in suppressing in himself anger and the fear of illness, is capable of overcoming the attrition of the years and attaining an age at least double that at which men now die of old age. Comte Saint Germain. A man who knows everything and who never dies, Voltaire. Comte Saint Germain was noted for rubbing elbows with the monarchies, many of which commented on his elaborate shoes studded with $40,000 diamonds and pearls. No one knew their Figure 1. Comte Saint Germain. Source of his income. Then around 1727 he shared his secret money-making techniques to certain German bankers in hopes that they would use the money to help humanity. Using his techniques, they along with the monarchies choose to squander the money for themselves. Even to this day, these bankers have continued to keep this knowledge secret. Eventually Saint Germain realized the money was never going to be used for benevolent purposes, so he pulled his money out and in 1729 he put it into his own world trust. At the founding of the trust it was stipulated that this money would be released in the year 2000. Bankroll programs. Around the turn of the century, the children of robber barons and banksters began to see the error in their parents' evilness and their use of wealth. These 100 children are known as wealthy visionaries. Together they invested some of their family's money into secret money roll programs, to be used for humanitarian purposes. The bankroll programs allow wealthy investors to make insane profits by ripping off the assets and resources from third world nations. The profits from these programs are utterly astronomical, as monthly returns can be in excess of 100,000 and 500,000. The name roll programs comes from a method of rolling money over and over in short periods of time. At the end of each cycle investors then reinvest or roll the principal and interest earned over into the next cycle. In the late 1990s the bankroll programs finally ceased. Money earned from these bankroll programs became known as the prosperity programs. Over time the programs were secretly opened up to small investors so that one could invest as little as $100 at a time. These small amounts were handled by trustees, who collected the money and kept records, and combined the small investments into the large amount, let's say, $1 million, that was required in order to enter a roll. The news of these programs spread by word of mouth and especially via multi-level marketers. Thousands of people invested and great wealth was generated, but little, if anything, was ever paid back to the investors. Trustees such as Clyde Hood and Mike Kadosky were sent to jail under false charges. Then corruption, greed, and fraud became widespread among the bankers, government, and even some trustees who wanted to steal the money for themselves. Even the Bush family had their hands in the pot. Using Promise software they could transfer stolen funds without being traced. Many have died because of this wealth, but God has another plan for humanity. The time has now come to release these prosperity funds and the funds from Saint Germain's World Trust. This money will be used to buy out all oil corporations, banks, pharmaceutical cartels, and zero out all debt. 250 years of compound interest has mushroomed the World Trust into a net worth in excess of $1 quadrillion. That's one with 40 zeros behind it. This is enough money to buy a gold cube the size of the orbit of Saturn. So astronomical most people will not believe it. The money from the World Trust will be distributed in the following manner. Level 1 World Trust. This is under the trusteeship of Master Saint Germain. At his direction, the World Trust can only be activated for payout at only 2 times during any given year, Easter and Christmas. At Saint Germain's orders, the World Court activates the funding process. This process continues down through the 4 lower levels of trusts to the people, and under certain conditions the funding window remains open until the next holiday funding window begins. For example, if the Easter window is activated, the window can remain open until December 24th, the day before Christmas, at which time it closes. The window remains open only if significant funds are moved to certain designated trusts during a set period of time. If not, the funding window is closed when such deadlines are not met. Level 2. These are the 180 royal trusts under the control of trustees in various sovereign countries. Examples are the French Trust, the Russian Trust, and the Vatican Trust. Level 3. These are the family trusts under the control of trustees of the world's wealthiest families. Examples are Bronfman, Warburg, Morgan, Rothschild, and Rockefeller. Level 4. These are the 250-plus corporate trusts under the control of trustees from powerful companies and corporations. Examples are General Electric, Lockheed, General Motors, Boeing, Carnegie, Ford, Marriott and AT&T. There are 4-5 trustees per trust, which means that approximately 1,200 trustees must sign documents to move money through these trusts. Level 5. These are the Prosperity Program trusts, which represent the various 70-75 bankroll programs which are under the control of designated program trustees. Again, there are 4-5 trustees per trust, or some 350 persons who must sign documents to activate these trusts. Some examples include Bergveen, SBC, ITI, Savage, Morgan, Omega, and Freedom. The largest trust is Freedom, and it must be funded first. It is these trusts that hold the wealth from the enlightened robber baron children. Then finally the funds will be released to the common man. As the funds pass through each trust, the trustee must use only certain designated safe banks and sign the proper documents with only certain designated banking personnel at those banks. Should this process be activated and then be stalled by deceitful bankers, deceitful trustees, etc., and the deadlines for funding to reach certain trusts are not met, the funding window is then closed. This is the problem. Members of the Bush family are blocking the release of these funds. Nazara. Change is on the horizon, and it begins with Nazara. There is much disinformation on the internet pertaining to this law. Sources such as squatloose.com, which is a CIA front, Nazara.org, which is owned by the Bush family, the 33rd Zion Lodge, the NSA, Sherry Shriner, and various internet channelings straight out of CIA land have been spouting much disinformation and confusion on the subject. The information on the Wikipedia even has its facts wrong. Wikipedia gives you the history of Harvey Barnard Nazara Law. If you look closely, this law, it stands for National Economic Stabilization and Recovery Act, which would reform the economy and replace the income with a national sales tax. This law was rejected by Congress in the 1990s. However, there is another Nazara law on the books. This Nazara stands for the National Economic Security and Reformation Act. It's the most groundbreaking reformation to sweep not only this country but our planet in its entire history. The act does away with the Federal Reserve Bank, the IRS, the secret government, and much more. History of Nazara. To understand Nazara's origins, we must go back to the early years of the American Republic. Ever since England lost her most prized jewel, the American colonies, the Royal Crown was looking for ways to take back what was once theirs. The pioneers of our new republic knew the threat that faced the young nation. To ensure its survival, a nobility amendment was passed to prevent anyone who had loyalties to the crown from holding public office. The 13th Amendment was approved by Congress and the House of Representatives in 1810. It was ratified by all the necessary states into law on March 12, 1819. It reads as follows. 13th Amendment. If any citizen of the United States shall accept, claim, receive or attain, any title of nobility or honor, or shall, without the consent of Congress, accept and retain any present, pension, office or emolument of any kind whatever, from any emperor, king, prince or foreign power, such person shall cease to be a citizen of the United States, and shall be incapable of holding any office of trust or profit under them, or either of them. This amendment was unacceptable for the British Crown because this would essentially cut off all meddling into the affairs of the new Republic's government. It would also mean anyone who is a member of the Bar, Lawyer, Association would not be allowed to hold public office. Remember, the BAR is short for the British Accredited Registry. This amendment is technically still in effect today, and therefore all the laws that have been made by lawyers remains unconstitutional, as they are not allowed to be U.S. citizens. This is why England fought in a war with us in 1812. Washington, D.C. was burned to the ground and the original documents which proved this was indeed a law were destroyed. The British monarchy knew the American people would never tolerate British rule again, so they offered back the Republic to the people with one exception. The 13th Amendment was to be removed from the Constitution. Nearly 200 years have now since passed. We have been conquered and yet we don't know it. Then we had the Civil War, which was really about the Rothschild family trying to gain control of the South's cotton industry. Then we had the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which put America into slavery. Finally, in the early 1990s we started to see a change. Nazara. The beginnings of Nazara takes us back to the early 1970s when the banks were foreclosing on farmers' mortgages all over the United States. The Willie Nelson Live Aid concerts were one of the fundraisers that helped these farmers. The farmers soon realized the banks were not only charging exorbitant and illegal amounts of interest, but they were illegally foreclosing on their homes. When these farmers began to seek legal action against the banks, they soon realized that the government and banks were working in collusion with each other. So in the early 1990s, they sought the help of the Farmers Union and did in-depth research on all the banks' illegal activities. A series of lawsuits were initiated against the banks and the government. Over 336,000 farm claims filed for fraud against the U.S. federal government, with an average of $20 million per claim. This amounts to $6.6 trillion total. In retaliation, the banks and the government sent the IRS against the farmers. When the farmers realized they were being unfairly targeted by the IRS, they began looking for ways to fight back. They requested help from military generals such as General Race Wasinger, to sit in the courtroom to ensure the bribed judges would vote according to constitutional law. These court cases ran up and down various state and federal courts from 1970s till the 1990s. Then in 1992-1993, the farmers appealed their case to the U.S. Supreme Court. Almost unanimously, the U.S. Supreme Court justices ruled that the Farmers Union claims were valid, and that the U.S. federal government and the banks had seriously defrauded the farmers, and all U.S. citizens, out of vast sums of money and property. Furthermore, the court ruled the shocking truth that the IRS and the Federal Reserve were unlawful, that the Income Tax Amendment was never ratified by the U.S. states, and that the U.S. government had illegally foreclosed on farmers' homes with the help of federal agencies. Irrefutable proof of such was presented by a retired CIA agent. He provided testimony and records of the bank's illegal activity, to lead further evidence that the Farmers Union claims were legitimate. The justices recognized that to remedy this situation, massive reformations would be required. Now, when rulings are made by the U.S. Supreme Court, one or more justices are assigned to monitor the progress on how the rulings are carried out. In this case, 5 justices were assigned to a committee to develop steps to implement required government and banking reformations. As the justices went about developing the required reformations, they enlisted the help of experts in economics, monetary systems, banking, constitutional government and law, and many other related areas. The justices built coalitions of support and assistance with thousands of people worldwide. These thousands of people working to bring us Nazara have been named White Knights. This term White Knights was borrowed from the world of big business hostile takeovers. It refers to how a vulnerable company is rescued from a hostile takeover by a White Knight corporation or wealthy person. This term is a most accurate term, for these White Knights are working behind the scenes to stop the madness. After the trial, the damages process name was changed to bank claims. From 1993 through 1996, U.S. citizens filed bank claims against the banks and the federal government through the U.S. Treasury Department to obtain payment for the damages as specified by the U.S. Supreme Court. This process closed in 1996. Gag order. Due to the groundbreaking changes required, an extremely strict gag order was placed on everyone directly involved, and the court cased records. Anyone who broke this gag order would receive the death penalty. Furthermore, all court records were sealed until after all the reforms are completed. To maintain this secrecy, the case details for the docket number assigned to the Farmers Union case were changed. As a result, doing a search for this case will fail to reflect the correct information until after the reformations are made public. At every step of the process, anyone directly involved has been required to sign an agreement to keep the U.S. Supreme Court's process of implementing the required reformations secret, or face charges of treason which are punishable by death. This gag order was placed on all media personnel, government officials, and bank employees. This is why Alex Jones or TV news anchors will not talk about this on air. Nor will Wikipedia tell you the truth behind the law. Nor will Sherry Shriner, who is nothing more than a CIA stooge. Minnesota Senator Paul Wellstone was about to break the gag order, but before he could, his small passenger plane crashed, killing his wife, daughter, and himself. Accords. To implement the required changes, the 5 justices spent years negotiating how the reformations would occur. These agreements, known as accords, were made with the U.S. government, the Federal Reserve Bank owners, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and with numerous other countries including the United Kingdom and countries of the Eurozone. The U.S. banking system reformations require the Federal Reserve Bank system be absorbed by the U.S. Treasury Department and the bank's fraudulent activities stopped. Plus, remedies will need to be made to U.S. citizens for past harm due to fraud. The U.S. banking reformations will impact the entire world, and therefore the IMF, World Bank, and other countries had to be involved. As the years began to pass, the military generals who originally helped the farmers soon realized that the government had no intentions of implementing the accords. So, the justices authorized the reformations be put into the form of a 75-page document known as the National Economic Security and Reformation Act, NASARA. NASARA implements the following changes. 1. Zeroes out all credit card, mortgage, and other bank debt due to illegal banking and government activities. 2. Abolishes income tax. 3. Abolishes IRS, creates 14% flat rate non-essential new items only sales tax revenue for government. 4. Increases benefits to senior citizens. 5. Returns constitutional law to all our courts and legal matters. 6. Establishes new presidential and congressional elections within 120 days after NASARA's announcement. 7. Monitors elections and prevents illegal election activities of special interest groups. 8. Creates new U.S. Treasury currency, rainbow currency, backed by gold, silver, and platinum precious metals. 9. Initiates new U.S. Treasury bank system in alignment with constitutional law. 10. Eliminates the Federal Reserve System. 11. Restores financial privacy. 12. retrains all judges and attorneys in constitutional law. 13. Ceases all aggressive, U.S. government military actions worldwide. 14. Establishes peace throughout the world. 15. Initiates first phase of worldwide prosperity distribution of vast wealth which has been accumulating for many decades. Every American citizen over the age of 21 will receive $100,000 a month for 11 years. The law requires that the farmer's claims to be paid first before the general public receives funds. Remember, these funds will come from the Level 5 Trust, bankroll programs. 16. Releases enormous sums of money for humanitarian purposes. 17. Enables the release of new technologies such as free energy devices, pollution cleanup, and sonic healing machines. This law was passed secretly on March 9, 2000 by Congress. It was voted on by 7 members of Congress, which were the only ones constitutionally allowed to hold office. This is because the Nobility Amendment prevents anyone with ties to the Crown from holding office. Plus, NASARA requires all Congress members to resign immediately, so all the corrupt members of Congress refuse to vote. From its very inception, Bush Sr., the false Congress, and major bank houses, and the Carlyle Group opposed NASARA. Secrecy was maintained by revising the official congressional registry. The details of the bill number for NASARA were revised to reflect a commemorative coin and revised again more recently. Our members of Congress will not tell us any of this because they have been ordered by the U.S. Supreme Court justices to deny the existence of NASARA or face charges of treason punishable by death, and some members of Congress have actually been charged with obstruction and threatened with treason charges. Therefore, all members of Congress pretend that NASARA has not been passed in order to comply with the justice's gag order. This is why there are no public congressional records. The unelected cloned President Bill Clinton and his puppet masters have no interest in signing NASARA into law. So, the military generals enlisted the help of the elite Naval SEALs and the Delta Force. Together they stormed the White House and under gunpoint forced Bill Clinton to sign NASARA into law. This occurred on October 10, 2000. Before NASARA is announced to the public, it is stipulated that the original farm claims must be paid out first in with gold or precious metals-backed currency as stipulated by the Constitution. Therefore they cannot be paid in Federal Reserve notes, which is not money anyway. The $6.6 trillion is to be distributed in the form of ATM debit cards from the new gold-backed treasury system. This money will come from the bankroll programs originally set up by benevolent Illuminati families. The only catch is to release these funds. They must first be released by Goldman Sachs and Bank of America, which are owned by the Rockefeller and Bush cabals. To prevent the funds from being released, the banking documents, which contains instructions on how to access the funds, are being transported 24/7 between warehouses in Charlotte, NC and Washington, D.C. The drivers of these FedEx trucks are heavily bribed, and many are afraid of reprisals from the Bush family if they deliver their payload as required by law. One time when these packets were returned to Washington, D.C., Bush placed them under military guard. Federal judges ordered him to release the funds. G.W. Bush replied, "You will never receive these packages, they belong to me." The judge answered, "I can do no more, he is President of the U.S. The news media were called and refused to film the guards, saying he is the president and we are afraid of what he will do. Code for "We also work for the Illuminati." This has been going on for some time, so the IMF and World Bank got together along with the Rothschild family to set up a new global banking system backed by gold. This will ultimately kill the Federal Reserve System, which is worthless fiat money. It was approved by Congress on September 19, 2007. On October 19, 2007, at midnight, the U.S. Treasury of the Republic went online with the global banking system. The next step is announcing this to the public, but it's not an easy task to do. Many powerful groups have tried to stop the announcement and implementation of the NASARA law. 18 months after NASARA became law, The justices had the current Congress passed resolutions approving Nazara on September 9, 2001. On September 10, 2001, George Bush Sr. moved into the White House to steer his son on how to block the announcement. The next day Nazara was set to be announced at 10 a.m. on September 11, 2001. 9/11 attacks. Groups opposing Nazara arranged for the attacks to occur on 9/11 to keep Nazara from being announced. Just before the announcement, Bush Sr. ordered the demolition of World Trade Center to stop the international banking computers on floors 1 and 2, in the North Tower from initiating the new U.S. Treasury bank system. George Bush Sr. decapitated any hopes of returning this government back to the people. Despite the fact the Bush family was to be paid off $300 trillion to cooperate with Nazara, they choose instead to maintain control over us. Ultimately, in the end, the Bushes will end up with nothing. Without a gold-backed treasury system, our country is headed to economic collapse and eventual civil war. Logistics of 9/11. We are all familiar with the official story of September 11. 4 jetliners were hijacked by groups of 4 and 5 Arabic men armed with box cutters, who flew 3 of the 4 jets into the Twin Towers and Pentagon. The World Trade Center, weakened by the fires, collapsed into piles of rubble. Later that afternoon, the 47-story Building 7 collapsed due to fire, a fact which most people are unaware of. The FBI had compiled a list of hijackers within 3 days, and so it was obvious that Osama bin Laden had masterminded 9/11 from caves in Afghanistan. With that in mind, there was no need to seriously investigate 9/11. The problem is when one investigates the conflicts of interest and red flags, we find a long series of improbable coincidences. It is standard operating procedure, SOP, to scramble a jet fighter whenever an airliner goes off course or radio contact is lost. Between September 2000 and June 2001, interceptors were scrambled 67 times. In 2000, jets were scrambled 129 times. The Air Traffic Control System continuously monitors air traffic and notifies NORAD of all deviations. NORAD is responsible for monitoring air and space traffic continuously, and is prepared to act immediately to threats and emergencies. It has the authority to order units from the Air National Guard, the Air Force and other armed services in pursuit of airliners in trouble. With this in mind, what would cause the massive breakdown in the chain of command? According to the Pentagon, NORAD was conducting a mock terrorist drill on 9/11. This is why they were unable to scramble jets in time. This seems to conflict with Secretary of Transportation Norman Mineta's testimony before the 9/11 Commission. He reports that at the time of the attacks, both Dick Cheney and himself was in the Presidential Emergency Operations Command Center. Norman recalled an officer coming in every few minutes to question the vice president if NORAD should continue to stand down and not shoot the airplanes out of the sky. During the time that the airplane was coming into the Pentagon, there was a young man who would come in and say to the vice president, "The plane is 50 miles out. The plane is 30 miles out." And when it got down to the plane is 10 miles out, the young man also said to the vice president, "Do the orders still stand?" And the vice president turned and whipped his neck around and said, "Of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary?" The airplanes which flew into the Twin Towers were military aircraft, as no normal 747 could maneuver the way they did. Remember, the hijackers nearly flunked out of flight school. How are they able to maneuver an airplane in such a way even expert pilots could not? These planes were most likely flown using autopilot because all 5 planes had their black box in-flight recorders turned off at the same time. The recorder is turned off when the airborne warning and control system takes over the craft. The planes were controlled using the U.S. Air Force's QRS-11 triaxial remote guidance system called GPLS. Essentially, it's a gyro on a chip. It uses GPS satellite technology and electronics implanted in the Boeing aircraft, allowing them to be controlled remotely. The truth is the September 11 attacks were carried out using remote processes. It was planned out by a CIA unit of 100 people, Aquarius. In August of 2001, this group carried out the attacks and staged the so-called cell phone calls purported to be from passengers on the commercial airlines by using voice impersonation technology and other remote technologies. This same CIA group also created the conspiracy story of 19 Arab hijackers, many of whom were either dead or in jail in the Middle East. As for the airline passengers on 9/11, they were probably gassed aboard their plane and then sent to either the Amtrak facility in Kansas City, Kansas, or the FEMA crematorium in Terre Haute, it to be incinerated. Explosions in WTC. The official NIST's, National Institute of Standards and Technology, investigation is often cited as proving the theory that planes and fires caused the collapses. Yet the report fails to mention how the buildings could collapse due to fire without a historical precedent of any steel-framed skyscraper collapsing other than a controlled demolition. In the entire report, only 2 sentences in a half-page section gives us hints as to what really happened. This troublesome issue is avoided by placing them outside the scope of its investigation, claiming that global collapse was inevitable after the initiation of collapse. A striking distinction of the World Trade Center collapse was the pulverization of the concrete into dust and gravel before it hit the ground. This can be seen in videos which show the towers mushrooming into vast clouds as they fall, leaving only twisted pieces of steel and no large pieces of concrete. While the building is collapsing, you can see puffs of smoke exploding each floor out in a timed demolition. These puffs of smoke are called sprites, which explode outward 10 to 15 floors below the rubble as the building collapses. This would suggest the detonators were on a timed circuit set to go off in a controlled manner. This also explains why the building collapsed in a free fall. An unobstructed free fall using Newtonian physics would be 6 seconds. Logic would dictate as the building collapsed, the floors below it would reduce the speed. However, the World Trade Center collapsed in 7 seconds. All of this makes sense, especially when you consider the testimony from the firefighters. They reported hearing bombs going off, but the media ignored their testimony. Even Columbia Observatory recorded minute explosions on seismograph, moments prior to the collapse. William Rodriguez, who worked as a janitor, reported hearing explosions in the basement just moments prior to the airplane colliding into the World Trade Center. Hillary Clinton promised him a high position in her government if he remained silent about this. Instead, he refused. Even today, the media continued to ignore and distort his testimony. Prior to 9/11, no steel building had ever collapsed due to fire. There is no way jet fuel could burn hot enough to melt the steel in the WTC. This is because steel melts at 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit. And jet fuel burns at 1,800. Even if the beams buckled, it wouldn't cause them to melt with the fireproofing protection. The truth is the fire burned around 700 degrees and was about to extinguish itself. This can be confirmed by the black smoke which occurs in an oxygen-deprived fire. There is no way the fires could have burned as hot as the government claims, especially when the videos show people sitting at the edge of the impact hole waiting to be rescued. Furthermore, Stephen Jones, professor of physics at Brigham Young University, found that the rubble had evidence of evaporated steel and thermite, which is used in controlled demolitions. In order for steel to evaporate, it would require temperatures in excess of 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Even 3 weeks after the World Trade collapsed, there were still areas of rubble which were so hot firefighters could not go near it. Maybe this explains why the government was so eager to ship all the evidence, rubble, to China and South Korea. This was crime scene, and by removing the evidence the government violated crime scene laws. Oddly enough, the company which was given the task to do this was none other than Controlled Demolition Incorporated. It's funny thing, with all this heat, how come the terrorists' passports which linked Al-Qaeda to the attacks failed to burn in the inferno as claimed by the government? So now the question is, how did those explosives get into the building without anyone noticing it? On the weekend of 9/8 and 9/9 there was a power down condition in the South Tower. For 36 hours there was no electrical supply from the 50th floor and up. This would mean there would be no security cameras, security locks on doors. Maintenance workers reported seeing engineers coming in and out of the building, and the sound of heavy objects moving around on floors which were supposed to be unoccupied. Even more red flags are raised when one considers the fact that bomb-sniffing dogs patrols were halted on September 6, 2001. So who allowed this to happen? Securicom, later renamed Stratosec, was responsible for the security of the WTC complex. Marvin Bush, G.W.'s brother, was on the board of directors. Isn't it odd that he has never been investigated, especially considering Securicom was also in charge of security for United Airlines and Dulles International Airport, the same place where the reported hijackers boarded the planes. Building 7. Building 7 was the third building to collapse on 9/11 according to the government. Fires leveled the building. The only problem with this is, fires have never leveled a steel skyscraper before. The team that investigated the collapse was kept away from the crime scene. By the time their report was published in May 2002, the evidence had been destroyed. Building 7 had a number of fires of limited extent and unknown duration before the total collapse at 5:20 p.m. Official reports assume the debris from the North Tower ignited the fire at 10:29 a.m. FEMA's report blamed the collapse primarily on fires, though it was inconclusive. NIST suggested it was caused by severe structural damage. However, other skyscraper fires exhibited more extensive burns and longer lasting than Building 7, but none of these other buildings collapsed. From the video evidence, it is clear Building 7 collapsed in a controlled demolition type manner. Even the owner of the WTC complex, Larry Silverstein, admitted to this fact in 2002 on PBS. I remember getting a call from their fire department commander, telling me that they were not sure they were gonna be able to contain the fire. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and we watched the building collapse. Pulling is a term used in controlled demolitions. Now it takes weeks of planning and installation of detonators for a successful controlled demolition. How could all these detonators be conveniently in place unless Silverstein had foreknowledge the attacks would occur? Perhaps this explains why he bought a 99-year insurance policy worth $7 billion months prior to the attack. The truth is, the World Trade Center was loaded with asbestos. It would have cost much more than $7 billion to take the building apart piece by piece to remove the stuff. So not only is it cheaper to do a controlled demolition, Larry Silverstein made money from it too. Buildings which were much closer to the World Trade Center sustained more damage yet did not collapse due to fire. So how is it that Building 7, which was 2 buildings away from the North Tower, developed these fires when it wasn't hit with a plane? Maybe this can be answered when we look at who has the most to gain from the destruction of this building. The following are the prime suspects in the 9/11 collapse. In WTC 7, the seconds was storing thousands of files related to pending Wall Street investigations on companies such as Enron and WorldCom. Conveniently, these documents were destroyed when the building collapsed. Other tenants in WTC 7 include the IRS, CIA, Secret Service, FBI, and Department of Defense. Building 7 also served as the command center for the security of the entire WTC complex, which was headed by the president's brother, Marvin Bush, whose contract ended coincidentally on 9/11. It was also host to then Mayor Rudy Giuliani's Office of Emergency Management Command Center. This was built on the 23rd floor, in 1998 as a bunker for emergencies such as 9/11. It had bullet and bomb-resistant windows, its own water and air supply, the ability to withstand 160 miles per hour winds, and a full commanding view of the entire WTC complex. Interestingly, on 9/11 Giuliani didn't bother to put the center to use, even though that's what it was built for. He decided instead to set up a makeshift command center down the street. Isn't it strange that the official 9/11 Commission report choose to omit any reference to Building 7? What else are they hiding from us? What happened to the debris from Flight 93 in Pennsylvania? It was mysteriously missing, with the only evidence left, a 15-foot hole in the ground. The truth is Flight 93 was intended to hit Camp David. If you go to YouTube you can hear the actual sound bites from the new networks which announce Flight 93 hit Camp David. Seriously folks, 9/11 was totally scripted that day. Camp David was targeted by our government because it was the anniversary of the Camp David Accords, which was the 1978 Israeli-Egypt peace treaty. Israel is actually a state within their United States, so it's really the US-Egypt peace treaty. By blaming the Muslims it would have given our government another excuse to bomb the Middle East. Why was there no investigation in the put options on American Airlines stock? Why was members of the Bin Laden family flown out of the country on 9/11 when all other planes were grounded? Where did the missing $700 million stash of gold stored under the WTC complex disappear to? The questions go on and on. The government will not answer them because they are at fault. The whores in the media will not tell us the truth, as many of the major news networks have been paid off to lie to the American people. It's all about the money. Pentagon. There is no way a 124-foot wide Boeing 757 airplane could fit into a hole 15-18 feet wide. So what hit the Pentagon if it wasn't a passenger airplane? Unfortunately the government confiscated most evidence covering up what happened. After the impact, Pentagon officials confiscated 80 video cameras which were focused on the Pentagon, and eyewitnesses had to sign non-disclosure agreements. To date only one of these videos has been released and this video is only 4 frames. All we can conclude from the video is a blurry metal bogey of some sort hit the Pentagon. It is safe to rule out a 757, because such a large aircraft flying at 450 miles per hour would literally be torn apart from turbulence created while flying under 60 feet in altitude. The truth is Bush ordered the destruction of the Pentagon building to prevent this country from returning back to constitutional law. Remote pilot technology was used to fly a small white private plane loaded with explosives into the Pentagon at the exact location of the White Knights in their new Naval Communications Center. At the time they were coordinating activities supporting Nazar's implementation nationwide. Al-Qaeda. Every time Bush says we are in a war against terrorism, the terrorists they are referring to are not Al-Qaeda, the terrorists are the American people. Patriot Acts 1 and 2 will eventually take away basic constitutional liberties such as a trial by jury and search warrants. Furthermore, anyone who tries to cash their refund from the Nazara Trust funds are arrested under the Patriot Act and Homeland Security Gestapo. When one takes a closer look at the secret memos and executive orders, the intent of the elite is clear. We are now living in a police state just like our Nazi leaders have always planned for us. He who trades liberty for security, deserves neither and will lose both. Thomas Jefferson. The Bush family and the Bin Laden family are in fact best friends. They were both business partners in Saudi oil and members of the Carlyle Group. According to Patrick Bellringer, the Bush family was protecting Bin Laden. He checked into the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, MN prior to September 11, 2001 seeking medical treatment for his kidney problems. The hospital gave him and his family a floor unto themselves for privacy. He later died on December 26, 2001 from kidney, renal failure and lung complication. The big lie by the US government is to keep the people believing there are terrorists out there to get us. It's hard to have a war on terrorism if there are no terrorists. Furthermore, the media refuse to investigate how a dying man can survive on a dialysis machine in remote Pakistani caves for over 6 years. When you analyze the video footage, the seismic data, and eyewitness accounts, the government's conspiracy theory just does not make sense. This fictional story has given Bush an excuse to send the US military to Afghanistan, Iraq, and create Patriot Act 1 and 2. Now you know why on 9/11, Bush Jr. sat in a classroom reading a children's book about a pet goat for 7 minutes, as if this epic cosmic tragedy was no big deal. Now our country remains at war and the media covers up the amount of body bags coming out of Iraq. Nor do they report the real death totals on 9/11. The actual death count is 30,700. No one questions the insanely small numbers given out by the government because New York City is a large place. People who have lost loved ones do not make contact with others who have died in 9/11. So they have no way of knowing how many truly died, especially when their government lies to them. The following death totals comes from the Pleiadian Commander-in-Chief Hatton, more on who he is later. Casualties report March 2003 till January 2007. Iraq War U.S. soldiers killed 11,600 U.S. soldiers, war injuries 22,800 U.S. civilians killed 5,000 U.S. soldier bodies dumped into Persian Gulf 7,000. Iraqis killed 960,000 Iraqis injured 555,000. Official data of the U.S. Department of Defense, January 26, 2007 confirmed U.S. soldiers dead 3,063 U.S. soldier, hostile injuries 22,884 U.S. soldier non-hostile injuries and disease victims 24,823 casualties.org. Afghanistan War U.S. soldiers killed 680 U.S. soldiers. War injuries 660. Afghans killed 36,000 Afghans injuries 67,400. Official data of the U.S. Department of Defense U.S. soldiers official deaths 494 projects.washingtonpost.com, Fallen, Afghanistan, page 4. 9/11 World Trade Tower disaster people killed that day 30,700 total deaths to date resulting from this disaster 56,600 number of the 30,700 picked up by Starship that day 20,400. U.S. Government. Official death toll 2,752 U.S. Government. Officially identified 1,527.